Sure. So if I were to describe where we are in the business cycle using a phrase, I would say we are in a late cycle slowdown headed toward a recession. Of course, the really important question is, when will that recession be? Because there are dramatically different implications if it's a month from now versus 3 months from now versus a year from now. So I'm going to lay out how we think about the business cycle and the sequencing of a late cycle growth slowdown so that you can think about what are the signposts to look for on your way to a recession. So let's rewind the clock back to late 2021. What was happening? Well, inflation was picking up. The Fed was starting to realize that it was behind the curve a little bit. The Fed started to communicate to markets and market participants that it was going to raise rates. When the Fed says it's going to raise rates, usually they're talking about the Fed funds rate specifically, but the Fed funds rate is the policy rate or the benchmark rate for the entire US interest rate complex. So when the Fed raises the Fed funds rate, that puts upward pressure on, well, one, the Fed funds rate, two, short rates like the 1 month, 3 month, 1 year, 2 year bills. It puts upward pressure on the long end of the yield curve. So even the 10-year and the 30-year have 90% plus correlations with the Fed funds rate. And it even puts upward pressure on private market interest rates like mortgage rates. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a 93% correlation between the Fed funds rate and the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. So we're going to zero in on the 30-year fixed mortgage rate because this is one of the most important transmission mechanisms of monetary policy. So when the Fed raises rates and the mortgage rate goes up, the first impact of that is that it reduces demand for new homes financed with mortgages. And you can view that in the MBA purchase data, which is the data for mortgage applications for new home purchases. So not refinancings, new home purchases. And more or less instantaneously, demand goes down. As soon as mortgages become more expensive, people don't want them as much because it's harder to finance a home that way. So with less affordable mortgages comes fewer home sales. Has that happened the cycle? Yes. Total home sales, so new home sales plus existing home sales, are down about 40% from their cycle peak. Why does that matter? Well, housing is a leading indicator in its own right because housing drives a lot of goods consumption, specifically durable goods consumption. So what are durable goods? Technically, they're goods with a useful life of longer than 3 years. But what that really means is stuff like cars, furniture, home appliances like washing machines and dishwashers. They are the big financeable discretionary items that really drive most of the manufacturing cycle in the US. So when you see the ISM manufacturing PMI or the FRB's industrial production data, what's really driving those time series? Well, it's really demand for these durable goods that I just talked about, and housing is what's really driving that demand a lot of the time. So why have we seen recessionary PMI data? Why have we seen really weak industrial production data? It's because the housing market is completely locked up as a result of 7% plus mortgage rates. So we've made it thus far in the business cycle. What's next? Well, industrial companies then cut production, right? Because demand is weak, and companies can't sustain states of such low production and such weak activity forever because it starts to compress margins because they have fixed costs, for example, personnel. And so what you see next is that manufacturing companies tend to start laying people off. And are we at that stage in the business cycle yet? As it turns out, yes. If you look at the BLS data on manufacturing employment, we've seen, layoffs in 2 of the last 3 months. If you look at the ADP manufacturing data, employment data, it's much worse for whatever reason. ADP is considered a little bit less reliable than the BLS data, but we consider it just as one data point among many. And according to ADP, we've seen almost 200,000 net layoffs in manufacturing. We've also seen that start to metastasize into other leading industries, such as residential construction, transportation services like trucking, temporary staffing. We've seen layoffs in, I think, all 9 of the last 9 months in these sectors cumulatively. So we are starting to see weakness on the margins of the labor market. This is reflected in other data too, like wage growth, which is still high, but softening on the margins. And eventually this weakness, if it's going to become recessionary, metastasizes into the broader labor market, resulting in higher initial claims, higher initial jobless claims, which come out weekly, a higher unemployment rate, et cetera, et cetera. And when you see the labor market start to weaken, that's when the NBER starts to really sharpen its pencils in terms of dating the recession usually. And look, our view is that we get to a recession. I think that the key variable to watch is interest rates. It's really just a question of how long the Fed will keep its foot on the throat of the housing sector and the manufacturing sector. And they're indicating that they are willing to do it as long as is necessary to see the necessary weakness in the labor market to bring down wage growth to a level consistent with 2%. And ultimately, we think that the Fed will get what it wants. Our timing is that we see a recession. Well, we'll stick with the unemployment rate because the NBER determines recessions, and who knows exactly what they'll do.
Sure.
We think that we see the unemployment rate tick up toward 4% by year end of this year, and ultimately above 7% by August of 2024. So obviously that is a rather bold call. A 7% unemployment rate would indicate not only a recession, but a harder than average recession. And so maybe I'll stop there, but that is what we're looking forward to at Invictus.